Today, surviving a night at 40 below requires equipment that didn't exist 200 years ago. Synthetic insulation, vapor barriers, portable stoves, emergency blankets designed in laboratories. A modern sleeping bag rated for extreme cold costs hundreds of dollars and represents decades of materials science. The fur trappers who spent entire winters in the Rocky Mountains during the 1830s carried a wool blanket and, if they were lucky, a buffalo robe. That was it. Yet they slept through nights that would kill an unprotected person in hours. They didn't endure the cold. They solved it using nothing but fire, dirt, and knowledge passed from hand to hand across the frontier. The technique they used is nearly forgotten now. It was rarely written down, but it worked. And the story of how it worked reveals something remarkable about what ordinary people once knew. There is a photograph from 1887 that shows 3 cowboys sitting on horseback in a Montana blizzard. The snow is horizontal. The horses' manes are crusted white. The men's faces are barely visible beneath scarves and hat brims pulled low against the wind. They are not posed for the camera. They are simply enduring. And somewhere in that photograph, invisible but present, is a question that haunts anyone who looks at it long enough. Where did they sleep that night? The American frontier existed for roughly a century, from the first fur trappers pushing into the Rocky Mountains in the 1820s to the last open-range cattle drives, fading into memory by the 1890s. In that span of time, thousands upon thousands of men spent their nights on frozen ground, miles from shelter, with nothing between them and temperatures that could kill an unprotected body in hours. And somehow, most of them survived, not through luck, not through suffering stoically until dawn, but through a technique so simple, so elegant, that the people who needed it most almost never bothered to write it down. They called it a firebed, or coal bed, or sometimes nothing at all. Just something you knew, something someone had shown you once, something that passed from trapper to scout to cowboy through demonstration rather than explanation. The concept sounds almost too simple to work. Dig a trench in the earth, burn a fire in it until nothing remains but glowing coals, bury those coals under several inches of dirt, and then lie down on the warm ground and sleep through the coldest night the frontier could throw at you. The earth itself becomes a slow-release heating pad, radiating warmth upward for 8 hours or more, while the world above freezes solid. Modern survival instructors have tested this technique in conditions that would terrify most people. One wilderness educator, Ron Hood, documented sleeping on a firebed at 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, with the surface beneath him hovering around 75 degrees Celsius, warmer than most air-conditioned homes in summer. He wore canvas, not high-tech insulation. He built the bed with hand tools in rough terrain. And he slept through the night as comfortably as if he'd been indoors, while anyone without this knowledge would have faced a genuine fight for survival. The firebed is one of those techniques that seems to emerge from nowhere, already perfected. No one invented it. No patent was filed. No textbook prescribed its dimensions. It simply existed, passed from hand to hand across the frontier, learned in desperation and taught in camps, refined over generations by people who had no choice but to figure out what worked. The knowledge lived in the bodies and habits of trappers, hunters, and travelers who rarely committed anything to paper, and it nearly vanished when the way of life that sustained it disappeared. This is the story of that technique, not as a survival manual, but as a window into a world where ordinary people possessed extraordinary practical knowledge, knowledge that kept them alive, knowledge that most of us have never heard of, even though our great-great-grandparents may have needed it to survive a single winter journey. The firebed is a small thing in the grand sweep of frontier history. But in the right circumstances, it was the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. To understand why anyone would need to sleep on buried coals, you first have to understand what cold meant on the American frontier, not as an abstract concept, but as a physical reality that shaped every decision, every movement, every calculation about what the day would require. We live now in a world where cold is an inconvenience. The car takes a few extra minutes to warm up. The walk from the parking lot feels unpleasant. We turn up the thermostat and complain about the heating bill. But on the frontier, cold was something else entirely. Cold was a predator. It found the gaps in your clothing, the cracks in your shelter, the moment your attention wandered. And it killed people, not dramatically, not cinematically, but quietly, efficiently, while they were simply trying to get from one place to another. The Great Plains in winter could drop to 40, 50, even 60 degrees below zero in the worst years. At those temperatures, the rules of everyday existence change completely. Exposed skin freezes in minutes, metal burns to the touch. Breath crystallizes in the air before it leaves your mouth, then falls as a fine powder of ice. Water freezes so fast that a cup of it thrown from a bucket will shatter on the ground as solid ice before it lands. The air itself feels different, thinner, sharper, as if the cold has driven out everything soft and replaced it with something that cuts. The blizzard of 1886 and 1887, the one the ranchers called the Big Die-Up, sent temperatures plunging to approximately 50 degrees below zero across the northern plains. The snow came in waves that buried entire herds where they stood. Cattle drifted before the wind, walking until fences stopped them, then piling against the wire until they froze in great mounds of bodies that wouldn't be discovered until spring. Estimates suggest that 90% of the open-range cattle in some regions died in that single winter. Millions of animals. The rotting carcasses dotted the prairie for years afterward, and the smell of death hung over the territory when the thaw finally came. The following January, the schoolhouse blizzard struck without warning. On the morning of January 12, 1888, temperatures across the northern plains were unseasonably mild. Children went to school in light coats. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in a single hour. Teachers faced an impossible choice: keep the children in unheated schoolhouses through the night, or try to get them home through a whiteout so complete that people lost their way between buildings 50 feet apart. In Plainview, Nebraska, a teacher named Lois Royce tried to lead 3 children 82 yards to shelter. All 3 children froze to death before they reached it. The confirmed death toll reached 235 people, though estimates suggest the true number may have been closer to 1,000. This was the environment that frontiersmen navigated every winter, not occasionally, not in exceptional circumstances. Every year the cold returned, and every year survival depended on knowing what to do when the temperature dropped and help was days or weeks away. The men most exposed to this reality were the mountain men. The fur trappers who ranged through the Rocky Mountains from the 1820s through the 1840s, hunting beaver in streams that froze solid by November. There were perhaps 3,000 of them in total, scattered across a territory the size of Western Europe, traveling in small groups or entirely alone. Their equipment was minimal: a rifle, powder and shot, a knife, a few traps, a blanket, perhaps a buffalo robe if they were lucky. They carried what they could pack on a horse or their own backs, and they spent months at a time in terrain where the nearest settlement might as well have been on another continent. Robert Newell, a trapper who lived that life for years, captured it in a single sentence when the beaver trade finally collapsed. "We are done with this life in the mountains, done with wading in beaver dams and freezing or starving alternately." The phrase is worth pausing over. Freezing or starving alternately. Not as poetic exaggeration, but as a literal description of daily existence. This was not adventure tourism. This was not roughing it for a weekend. This was years spent on the razor edge of survival, where a single bad decision could mean death, and the margin between a good winter and a catastrophic one was measured in knowledge possessed or lacking. The mountain men learned from necessity, and much of what they learned came from the indigenous peoples they encountered, traded with, married into, and sometimes fought. Native Americans had lived through these winters for thousands of years. They knew which techniques worked and which didn't. They knew how to read the signs of coming storms. They knew how to make the land itself provide shelter and warmth when everything else had failed. We'll explore that transmission of knowledge shortly. How techniques passed from culture to culture, from generation to generation, without ever being written down. But first, it helps to understand just how central the problem of warmth was to survival on the frontier. Because the firebed isn't just a clever trick. It addresses the single most lethal aspect of sleeping outdoors in cold weather: the ground beneath you. This is something that surprises people who haven't spent much time camping in genuine cold. You imagine that the danger comes from the air, the wind, the falling temperatures, the exposure to elements. And those things matter. But a far greater threat lies beneath you. The earth itself is a heat sink. It draws warmth from your body relentlessly, conducting heat away from anywhere you touch it. According to U.S. Army survival training, ground contact can account for up to 80% of body heat lost while sleeping. 80%. You can pile blankets on top of yourself until you can barely move, and you'll still grow cold if you're lying directly on frozen ground. A campfire doesn't solve this problem. It heats the side of you that faces it, while the side against the ground grows colder by the minute. You rotate like a spit, warming one side, then the other, never comfortable, never truly resting. Mountain men described nights spent in this cycle, sleeping in fits, waking to turn, feeding the fire, then trying again. It was survivable, but barely. And when the conditions turned truly harsh, or the wood ran short, or exhaustion made it impossible to keep waking, it stopped being survivable at all. The firebed solved this problem in a way that seems almost too elegant. Instead of fighting the ground's tendency to steal heat, the technique reverses it entirely. The earth that was your enemy becomes your ally. The same material that would suck warmth from your body instead radiates warmth into it, slowly, steadily, for the entire night. You're not rotating above a fire, hoping to stay warm enough on each side to avoid hypothermia. You're lying on a surface that actively heats you from below, uniformly, for 8 hours or more. To appreciate the full weight of this problem, consider what the alternative equipment looked like. A Cowboys bedroll in the 1870s and 1880s consisted of a waterproof canvas tarpaulin, typically 6 by 14 feet to 7 by 18 feet, made of heavy cloth weighing around 18 ounces per square yard. Folded around several wool blankets and heavy homemade quilts called sugans. Rolled up, this kit weighed 30 to 50 pounds. It was cumbersome. It required a pack animal or wagon to transport on long journeys. And even with all that material, it was designed for relatively mild conditions. The bedroll kept you dry and provided insulation against moderate cold. It was not designed to keep you alive at 40 below. Before manufactured bedding became common, the premier insulation was the buffalo robe, a prime winter hide, carefully tanned and preserved, that traders purchased from indigenous suppliers for about 25 cents in trade goods and sold back east for $5 or $6 apiece. A good buffalo robe was genuinely warm, but it was also bulky, heavy, and available only when buffalo were available. Hunters slaughtered more than 500,000 animals on the southern plains in 1872 alone. The herds that had seemed inexhaustible were already collapsing by the time most homesteaders arrived. For a man traveling light, a trapper checking his lines, a scout moving fast, a hunter following game into unfamiliar territory, all this equipment might be unavailable. You had what you carried, and what you carried might be a single blanket, a coat, and whatever knowledge you'd accumulated about keeping warm when the world wanted you dead. Understanding how the firebed works requires looking at the technique itself, the actual process, step by step, that transformed cold earth into a heating pad without modern tools, manufactured materials, or anything that couldn't be found in the wilderness itself. The firebed begins with a trench. Dig into the earth about 8 inches deep, roughly the length of your hand from wrist to fingertips. Make it wide enough for your body, perhaps 12 inches or so, and long enough to stretch out, around 6 feet for most people. This sounds simple enough, but it's worth pausing to consider what it actually entails. On the frontier, you were digging with whatever you had. Perhaps a knife, perhaps a sharpened stick, perhaps, if you were lucky, a small camp shovel or a hatchet that could break up frozen soil. In truly cold conditions, the ground itself resists you. The top layer may be frozen hard enough that it needs to be chopped before it can be scooped. You're expending energy to dig, and energy on the frontier was precious. Sweating in cold weather was dangerous because wet clothing loses its insulation and becomes a liability. So the digging had to be done carefully, steadily, without working yourself into a lather that would soak your clothes and leave you worse off than when you started. The trench is not just a pit. It's the foundation of the entire system. Its depth matters. Too shallow, and there won't be enough room for both the coals and the dirt that will cover them. Too deep, and you've wasted energy digging what you don't need. 8 inches gave enough space for a substantial bed of coals with 4 to 6 inches of covering soil on top. Some practitioners lined the bottom of the trench with fist-sized rocks before building the fire. This added thermal mass to the system, more material to absorb heat and release it slowly through the night. The rocks needed to be dry. Stones from stream beds, ponds, or anywhere water might have soaked into their pores carried a genuine danger. Heated too fast, the moisture inside them turned to steam, and steam under pressure can shatter a rock explosively. People have been seriously injured by the shrapnel from exploding campfire rocks, dry rocks from dry land only. If there was any doubt, it was safer to skip the rocks entirely and rely on the earth alone. Once the trench was dug and prepared, the fire was built. And here, the choice of fuel made all the difference. Softwoods, pine, spruce, fir burn hot and fast. They throw impressive flames and generate heat quickly, but they also consume themselves quickly and leave behind light, ashy coals that don't hold heat for long. Softwood works fine for a campfire you intend to keep feeding through the night. But for a firebed, it's nearly useless. The coals it produces simply can't store enough thermal energy to warm the ground for 8 hours. Hardwoods, oak, maple, hickory, ash burn slower and produce dense, heavy coals that glow for hours. These coals are the key to the entire technique. They don't just radiate heat, they store it. A bed of hardwood coals 6 inches deep contains an enormous amount of thermal energy, released slowly as the coals cool from their initial temperature of 500 or 600 degrees Celsius down to something manageable. The fire needed to burn for at least 2 hours. Some sources say longer, depending on the intensity of the cold you were preparing for. This was time spent productively. While the fire burned, you could prepare your other gear, eat a meal, dry any clothing that had gotten damp during the day, and simply rest within the warmth of an open fire. The point was not to rush the process. Impatience here meant inadequate coals, and inadequate coals meant a bed that would grow cold before morning. When the fire had burned down to a thick layer of glowing coals, the next step required care. The coals needed to be spread evenly across the entire length of the trench. No gaps, no thin spots, no areas that would cool faster than others. Uneven coals meant uneven heating, which meant cold spots that would wake you in the night or leave you shivering by dawn. Then came the dirt. The soil that came out of the trench was now returned to it, covering the coals completely. And here was the critical measurement. The dirt needed to be thick enough to prevent burns, but thin enough to let warmth through. Modern survival instructors have converged on a range of roughly 4 to 6 inches, though experienced practitioners note that conditions vary. Dry, sandy soil conducts heat differently than dense, clay-rich earth. Cold ambient temperatures require more insulation than mild ones. Ron Hood, who taught the firebed technique to more than 6,000 wilderness students over 2 decades, codified the process in what he called the 2-for-8 mnemonic, 2-4-8. 2 hours of fire, 4 inches of dirt, 8 inches total depth. Simple enough to remember when you're exhausted and cold and thinking isn't easy. But the numbers were guidelines, not guarantees. The actual depth depended on judgment, and judgment came from experience. Drier western soils might need less coverage. Wetter, colder environments needed more. Ground conditions mattered enormously. Dry mineral soil worked best, sandy soil drained well, damp soil created dangerous steam, and root-laden soil had to be avoided entirely. Underground root fires can spread invisibly through the ground for days, only to emerge as a surface fire far from where you built your bed, sometimes long after you've left. Wet soil presented a particular challenge. The heat from the coals drives moisture upward, creating steam that rises through the soil and condenses on anything above it, including your clothing, your blankets, your body. A firebed built in damp ground without a vapor barrier could leave you soaked and shivering, worse off than if you'd never built it at all. The solution was to place something between you and the soil, a tarp, a poncho, a thick layer of pine boughs, anything that would block the rising moisture while still allowing the warmth to transfer. This is the kind of detail that doesn't appear in simple descriptions of the technique, but makes all the difference in actual practice. Once the dirt was in place, patience returned. You didn't lie down immediately. The heat needed time to equalize through the soil, distributing from the coals upward until the surface reached a comfortable temperature. Too soon, and the surface might still be cold while the layers below were dangerously hot. Too late wasn't really possible. The bed would simply continue radiating warmth for hours regardless of when you lay down. But the optimal window, according to those who used this technique regularly, was 30 to 45 minutes after covering the coals. There was a test you could perform to know when conditions were right. If the surface felt warm within 30 minutes, you'd probably use too little dirt. The heat was transferring too fast, and you risked burning yourself in the night as the coals remained hot and the insulating layer proved insufficient. If the surface didn't feel warm even after an hour, you'd use too much dirt, and the warmth might never reach you at all. The sweet spot was warmth arriving around 45 minutes. Enough dirt to buffer the heat, but not so much that it blocked it entirely. The fire also heated the earth laterally, not just upward. The heat, spreading outward from the trench, extended the warm zone roughly 18 inches beyond each edge of the coals. This meant a trench 12 inches wide could provide a sleeping surface nearly 4 feet across, enough room to shift, to turn, to sleep in something approaching comfort rather than balancing on a narrow, warm strip with cold earth inches away on either side. Finally, insulation went on top. Pine boughs, dry grass, leaves, anything that would create an air gap between the sleeper's body and the warm ground. This served multiple purposes. It provided cushioning on what was, after all, packed earth. It trapped air, which is itself an excellent insulator. And it helped manage any residual moisture that might rise from the soil. A buffalo robe or blanket went on top of this layer, and the sleeper lay down with the earth itself as their heating pad. The reports are consistent across modern practitioners. A properly built firebed produces roughly 75 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface in conditions well below zero. It maintains useful warmth for 8 hours or more. It allows genuinely restful sleep in circumstances that would otherwise demand constant vigilance, constant waking, constant feeding of a fire just to stay alive until morning. The most famous depiction of the technique appears in the 1972 film Jeremiah Johnson, where Robert Redford's character builds a firebed with insufficient dirt and begins to smolder in the night. His mentor, played by Will Geer, delivers the memorable correction, "Not enough dirt." The scene is played for gentle comedy, but it demonstrates a real danger. Too little soil meant direct contact with coals that could still be hot enough to burn clothing or skin. Too much meant the warmth never reached you. The technique required calibration, and calibration required experience. What's interesting about that film scene is where its technical accuracy came from. The movie's advisor for wilderness techniques was Larry Dean Olson, a BYU instructor who had spent years reconstructing the survival methods of the Anasazi and Paiute peoples of the Great Basin. When the scene needed authenticity, it drew not from written accounts of mountain men, which, as we'll see, are remarkably sparse on this subject, but from indigenous knowledge that Olson had learned through years of research and practice. The firebed in that iconic movie moment traces back not to a cowboy's memoir, but to traditions that predated European arrival by centuries or millennia. But understanding the method is only part of the picture. The real question is what separated someone who'd heard of this technique from someone who could actually make it work, the knowledge that came only through experience, trial, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had no choice but to get it right. The difference between knowing about the firebed and actually surviving a night on one came down to details that no written description could fully convey. The technique existed in the hands of the people who practiced it, in their sense of how long a fire needed to burn, how much dirt felt right when they tested it with their palms, how to read the particular soil and weather of a given night and adjust accordingly. Consider the problem of timing. 2 hours of fire was a guideline, but what counted as burned down to coals varied enormously depending on how much wood you'd used, how dry it was, how densely it was packed. A fire built from seasoned oak in dry conditions behaved differently than one scraped together from whatever deadfall you could find in a snowstorm. The experienced practitioner didn't watch a clock. They watched the fire. They knew by the color of the coals, by the way the flames had settled, by a dozen subtle indicators that the fuel had released its energy and was ready to be buried. The soil coverage required similar intuition. 4 inches measured by a ruler is one thing. 4 inches judged by eye while tired, cold, and working in fading light is another. Experienced users developed a feel for it, a sense of when enough was enough, when more dirt would help rather than hinder. This was knowledge that lived in the body, not the mind. You could explain it in words, but the explanation was always incomplete. The real learning happened through doing, through building firebeds that were too hot or too cold, through waking in the night to discover what you'd gotten wrong, through gradually developing the judgment that made the difference. There was also the question of what to do when conditions weren't ideal, which, on the frontier, was most of the time. The textbook firebed assumed you had access to hardwood, dry soil, and enough time to do everything properly. Reality often offered none of these things. A man caught by weather in pine country had to make do with softwood coals that burned faster and cooler. Someone crossing ground that was frozen solid might not be able to dig a trench at all and would need to build the fire on top of the ground and find another way to capture its heat. Wet conditions, high winds, rocky terrain, each presented problems that required improvisation, adaptation, the application of principles rather than the rote following of steps. The underlying physics of the firebed helps explain why it works so well when built correctly. Soil possesses a combination of properties that make it ideal for this purpose. High volumetric heat capacity, meaning it can absorb and store enormous amounts of thermal energy, paired with low thermal conductivity, meaning it releases that energy slowly rather than all at once. Dry soil stores approximately 800 joules of thermal energy per kilogram per degree of temperature change and conducts heat at only a fraction of the rate that metal or stone would. This makes it a natural, slow-release thermal battery. When coals at 500 or 600 degrees Celsius are buried under 10 to 15 centimeters of soil, the heat begins to flow upward according to the laws of thermal conduction. But it flows slowly. The temperature gradient between the coals and the surface is steep at first, driving significant heat transfer, but as the coals cool and the soil warms, the gradient decreases and the rate of transfer drops. The result is a natural tapering warmth curve that happens to match a human sleeping cycle remarkably well. Warmest in the early hours when the night is coldest, gradually cooling toward dawn as the sleeper's need diminishes. An often overlooked factor is that buried coals don't instantly extinguish. With restricted but non-zero oxygen permeating through unpacked soil, they continue to smolder slowly, generating additional heat beyond the stored thermal energy alone. The firebed is not just a passive heat sink. It's an active, slow-burning system that produces warmth even as its initial charge depletes. Meanwhile, burying the coals eliminates convective heat loss, the dominant energy waste pathway of an open fire where hot air simply rises away. All thermal energy must conduct through soil, making the system dramatically more efficient than a campfire you're simply lying near. Perhaps most importantly, the firebed addresses the fundamental problem of ground contact heat loss in a way that no amount of blankets or clothing can match. You're not trying to insulate yourself from a cold surface. You're lying on a warm surface. The heat transfer works in your favor rather than against you. This is why someone with only a canvas tarp and a properly built firebed could sleep more comfortably than someone with modern insulation lying directly on frozen ground. No peer-reviewed scientific study has ever tested firebed temperatures under controlled conditions. The knowledge base remains entirely empirical, built from the accumulated experience of practitioners rather than laboratory measurement. But the underlying soil thermal properties are well established in geotechnical literature, and the reported results are consistent enough across different sources to confirm that the technique works as described. 75 degrees at the surface, 8 hours of warmth, restful sleep in conditions that would otherwise be survivable only through constant vigilance. To understand what building and using a firebed actually felt like, it helps to imagine a specific moment, not an abstracted technique, but a particular night, a particular person, a particular set of circumstances that made this knowledge necessary. Picture a trapper in the northern Rockies, sometime in the 1830s. The beaver trade is still active, though the prices have started to fall. He's been working a stretch of streams for 3 weeks, moving his small camp every few days as he exhausts each area. His equipment is what he can carry: a rifle, a possibles bag with powder and shot, a knife, an axe, a few steel traps, a single wool blanket, and a buffalo robe he traded for at the last rendezvous. He's hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, weeks from anyone who could help him if something went wrong. The weather has turned. What started as a cold snap has deepened into something serious. The kind of cold that makes the trees crack in the night, that freezes the streams solid and drives the animals deep into their dens. He needs to get back to his base camp, but that's 2 days' travel, and the snow is too deep to move safely after dark. He'll have to spend the night where he is. The spot isn't ideal. The timber is mostly lodgepole pine, which burns fast and leaves poor coals. But there's a stand of aspen nearby, and aspen is better. Not as good as oak or hickory, but workable. He spends the last hour of daylight gathering wood, breaking dead branches from standing trees where they've stayed dry above the snow, dragging fallen logs close enough to feed the fire through the evening. The digging is hard. The ground isn't frozen solid. He's in a sheltered spot where the snow has insulated the earth, but it's cold and dense, and his small camp axe is made for cutting wood, not moving soil. He chops at the ground, loosens sections, scoops them out with his hands and a flat piece of bark. The trench takes longer than he'd like, and he's sweating by the end of it despite the cold. That's dangerous. He strips off his outer layer to let it dry by the fire, working in just his shirt while his coat steams on a branch nearby. The fire burns for nearly 3 hours. He feeds it steadily, building a bed of coals that glows orange in the darkness. While it burns, he eats, dried meat, a handful of parched corn, water from snow melted in his tin cup at the fire's edge. He checks his traps for tomorrow, mends a tear in his moccasin, does the small maintenance tasks that keep equipment functional in hard country. The fire is warmth and light and company, the one comfort in a landscape that offers few. When the coals are ready, he spreads them with a long stick, careful to distribute them evenly across the trench. Then the dirt goes back in, handful by handful, until the coals are buried under a layer he judges to be about the width of his hand. He gathers pine boughs from nearby trees, strips them from the branches, lays them in a thick mattress over the covered trench. His buffalo robe goes on top of that, fur side down, the leather side up to shed any moisture that might fall in the night. He waits. The stars are out now, impossibly bright in the cold, clear air. The temperature is dropping fast, maybe 20 below, maybe colder. Without the firebed, this would be a night of dozing and shivering, of waking every hour to feed flames, of arriving at tomorrow exhausted and depleted. With it, he has a chance at real sleep. After perhaps 40 minutes, he tests the surface. Warm. Not hot, not cold, just warm. The steady, radiant heat of earth that has absorbed fire and is giving it back slowly. He pulls his coat on, wraps his blanket around his shoulders, and lies down on the buffalo robe with his feet toward where his fire still burns low at the trench's edge. The warmth comes up through the robe, through the boughs, into his body. Above him, the cold presses down, but it can't reach him. He's warm. He sleeps. This scene is imagined but not invented. It's built from details that appear across accounts of mountain man life, the equipment they carried, the conditions they faced, the techniques they used to survive. No single trapper left a detailed description of building a firebed, which is itself significant. The people who used this technique most were the people least likely to write about it. They were not journalists documenting frontier life for Eastern readers. They were working men, often barely literate, focused on the practical business of survival rather than the recording of methods that seemed to them too obvious to require explanation. The knowledge passed through demonstration. A young trapper learned by watching an experienced one. A greenhorn hired for a cattle outfit learned from the men he worked alongside. The technique was shown, not told. Hands in the dirt, eyes on the fire, the quiet commentary of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, explaining what to watch for. Not enough dirt wasn't just a movie line. It was the kind of correction you'd hear from a mentor, watching you make the mistake so you'd remember not to make it again. This oral transmission is why the historical record is so thin. We have accounts of mountain men enduring terrible cold. We have accounts of them surviving conditions that should have killed them. We have accounts of their camps and their gear and their daily routines, but the specific techniques that made survival possible were rarely written down because they were rarely considered worth writing. Everyone who needed to know already knew. Everyone who didn't need to know didn't need to read about it. The knowledge was valuable precisely because it existed in people rather than on paper. It couldn't be stolen by a competitor or learned by someone who hadn't earned it through apprenticeship. The firebed did not exist in isolation. It was one technique within an interlocking system of survival knowledge, each piece supporting and enabling the others. To understand its place in frontier life, you have to see it as part of a web UE, connected to clothing, to shelter, to fire-making, to the seasonal rhythms that governed everything about how people lived. Consider the relationship between the firebed and other warming techniques. A trapper or traveler in cold country had several options, each suited to different circumstances. The long fire, 2 or 3 large logs laid parallel with flames burning between them, could warm a shelter or a sleeping spot for an entire night if tended properly. The Finnish called this the rakovalkea, and variations of it appeared wherever people needed sustained warmth from limited fuel. The fire reflector wall, green logs or stones stacked behind a fire to direct heat toward a lean-to. could nearly double the effective warmth at a given distance. Hot rocks, wrapped in cloth and placed in bedding, provided portable heat that required no digging, no trench, just stones and fire and something to carry them in. Each technique had advantages and limitations. The long fire required large logs and produced visible light and smoke that might be undesirable in certain situations. The reflector wall needed specific materials and worked best with a shelter to capture the directed heat. Hot rocks provided hours of warmth, but eventually cooled and needed to be reheated. The firebed required significant labor to construct, but then worked passively through the night, demanding nothing once it was built. A knowledgeable traveler carried all these techniques in their head, deploying whichever one fit the circumstances. Short on time, hot rocks in the bedding, have a good shelter site with large timber, long fire with a reflector, need to sleep warm in exposed terrain with only hand tools. Firebed. The techniques complemented each other, and competence meant knowing not just how to execute each one, but when to choose it. The firebed also connected to the broader challenge of managing body heat in cold environments, a challenge that began long before nightfall. Clothing on the frontier was not the technical outerwear we know today. Mountain men typically wore wool or buckskin, layered according to conditions, with buffalo robes or blankets as outer wraps when stationary. The critical principle was avoiding sweat. Wet clothing lost most of its insulation value and became actively dangerous, wicking heat away from the body faster than dry air ever could. A man who worked too hard, sweated through his clothes, and then stopped moving in cold weather was in serious trouble. This meant that everything about a frontier traveler's day was calibrated to manage exertion. You moved at a pace that kept you warm without overheating. You removed layers when working hard and added them when resting. You stopped to dry anything that got wet before continuing. The firebed fit into this system because building one required significant labor, digging, gathering wood, maintaining fire, that had to be managed carefully to avoid the sweating that would undo all your work. An experienced practitioner paced themselves, worked steadily rather than frantically, and kept their clothing dry even while expending the energy necessary to prepare for the night. The seasonal rhythm mattered too. The firebed was a cold weather technique, unnecessary in summer and impractical when the ground was saturated with spring melt. It belonged to the months between first hard freeze and final thaw, roughly November through March in most of the Mountain West, longer in higher elevations. During these months, it fit into a pattern of life adapted entirely to cold, the trapping of animals whose fur was prime only in winter, the travel that was easier on frozen rivers than through summer brush, the hunting of game that congregated in sheltered valleys when snow covered the high country. The self-reliance this required was extraordinary by modern standards, a single person or small group operating far from any support needed to possess the knowledge and skills that we now distribute across entire industries. They were their own shelter builders, fire makers, food procurers, clothing repairers, tool maintainers. The margin for error was thin. A lost knife, a lame horse, an injury that prevented work, any of these could cascade into disaster. The firebed was a small piece of this picture, but it was an essential piece. Without the ability to sleep warm, nothing else mattered. The community dimension shouldn't be overlooked either. While many frontier travelers operated alone or in small groups, the knowledge they carried came from communities, from the rendezvous gatherings where trappers traded not just furs, but information, from the indigenous peoples who shared techniques with those who earned their trust, from the informal networks that connected scattered individuals across vast territories. The firebed wasn't invented by any single person. It was refined over generations by people who shared what they learned, who watched each other's methods and adopted what worked, who built a collective body of knowledge even while living solitary lives. The firebed adapted to circumstances. What worked in the pine forests of the northern Rockies wasn't necessarily what worked on the treeless Great Plains or in the desert Southwest. The technique had variations, regional adaptations that reflected the specific challenges and resources of different environments. On the plains, the scarcity of hardwood presented obvious difficulties. A traveler might go days without seeing anything larger than cottonwood along a riverbank, and cottonwood burned poorly compared to the oaks and hickories of eastern forests. The solution was to use what was available: buffalo chips when wood was scarce, dried grass twisted into bundles, anything that would burn long enough and hot enough to heat the earth. The coals weren't as good as hardwood coals, so the fire might need to burn longer, or the trench might need to be shallower to ensure enough heat reached the surface. In mountainous terrain, the ground itself varied dramatically over short distances. Rocky soil couldn't be dug easily. Sandy soil drained heat too quickly. Clay-rich soil held moisture that turned to problematic steam. The experienced traveler learned to read terrain, to select camping spots, not just for water and shelter, but for the quality of ground they offered. A good site for a firebed was worth traveling an extra hour to reach. The desert Southwest presented entirely different challenges. The ground was often easy to dig, loose sand and dry soil that moved freely, but the same properties that made it easy to excavate also made it a poor heat reservoir. Sand has lower thermal mass than denser soils, meaning it can't store as much energy, and it's more porous, allowing heat to dissipate more quickly. Firebeds in desert environments might need to be deeper, with more coals and more burn time, to achieve the same result. Indigenous peoples across the continent had developed heating techniques adapted to their specific environments. The Dakota fire hole, 2 underground chambers connected by a tunnel, creating a natural draft for efficient, nearly smokeless fire, addressed the challenge of cooking and heating in open grassland, where smoke might signal your position to enemies and where wind made surface fires difficult to maintain. The earth lodges of the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and Pawnee were semi-subterranean structures excavated 1 to 3 feet below ground level, with thick walls of earth and sod that provided natural insulation. These lodges housed 30 to 60 people through plains winters, warmed by central fire pits whose heat was trapped by the earthen construction. The transmission of knowledge between cultures is difficult to trace precisely, but the circumstantial evidence is strong. Mountain men frequently married into indigenous communities, adopted their practices, and spent years living in close proximity to people who had survived these winters for countless generations. The techniques that allowed Euro-American trappers to survive in the Rockies were not invented by them. They were learned from people who already knew. One account describes how Native Americans built a pit in the middle of the floor with rocks buried underneath the floor. When the rocks were heated, it would radiate the warmth, essentially a permanent architectural firebed, the same principle adapted to stationary shelter rather than temporary camp. The practice of wrapping heated stones in leather and placing them in bedding for overnight warmth appears across multiple cultures, a portable version of the same thermal principle. George Washington Sears, who wrote under the pen name Nessmuk and produced one of the first major outdoor recreation guides in 1884, learned his woodsmanship from a Narragansett man whose name he adopted as his literary identity. Horace Kephart, whose encyclopedic camping and woodcraft remained in print for decades, explicitly credited Native American techniques throughout his work. Larry Dean Olson, who advised on Jeremiah Johnson and wrote the survival merit badge requirements for the Boy Scouts of America, spent years researching the methods of the Anasazi and Paiute peoples. The firebed, in other words, almost certainly didn't originate with Euro-American frontiersmen. They learned it from people who had been using it, or techniques like it, for centuries or millennia. Archaeological evidence pushes the relationship between fire and bedding back 200,000 years to sites in South Africa, where researchers have found grass bedding placed on ash layers, topped with insect-repelling plants. The exact technique of the buried coal firebed may or may not be that old, but the principle, using fire-heated earth as a source of sustained warmth, is as ancient as humanity's relationship with fire itself. The firebed faded from necessity because the world that required it disappeared. Barbed wire changed everything. Patented by Joseph Glidden in 1873, it first appeared in Texas in the late 1870s and spread across the plains with astonishing speed. By 1883, Glidden's company was producing 600 miles of wire per day. The open range that cattle had crossed freely for decades was suddenly divided, sectioned, and closed. The Chisholm Trail, which had carried millions of cattle north from Texas to the Kansas railheads, shut down in 1884. The Big Die-Up of 1886 to 87 devastated the remaining open-range operations. Railroads expanded to reach the cattle, eliminating the need for long drives. Refrigerated railroad cars allowed dressed beef to be shipped directly from slaughterhouses to distant markets. By 1895, trail driving had virtually ended. The fur trade had collapsed decades earlier. Beaver hats went out of fashion in the 1840s, replaced by silk, and the prices that had sustained the mountain men plummeted. The rendezvous system ended in 1840. Some trappers became guides for the wagon trains that would cross their territory. Others drifted into settlements and tried to adapt to a world that no longer had a place for them. The era that had required the firebed most, the mountain man period of small groups traveling light through remote terrain, lasted barely 2 decades. What replaced the firebed was manufactured equipment. Canvas tents that could be heated with small stoves, sleeping bags filled with down or wool batting, portable shelters that could be set up in minutes instead of hours. The labor that had once gone into preparing a warm sleeping spot was rendered unnecessary by gear that could be purchased rather than made, carried rather than constructed each night from whatever the land provided. The knowledge didn't disappear instantly. It persisted in pockets, among hunters and guides who still operated in remote country, among indigenous communities whose relationship with the land hadn't been entirely severed, among the handful of people who chose to maintain skills that the modern world no longer required. But each generation that passed without needing the firebed was a generation that didn't learn it. The chain of oral transmission that had kept the knowledge alive for centuries began to thin and fray. A few key figures worked to preserve what remained. Nessmuk's Woodcraft and Camping, published in 1884, documented frontier skills for a recreational audience that was beginning to seek wilderness experience as escape rather than necessity. Kephart's Camping and Woodcraft, first published in 1906 and revised in 1916, ran to 900 pages and attempted to capture everything the author had learned about living in wild country. These books saved techniques that might otherwise have been lost entirely, translating oral tradition into written form for the first time. In the 20th century, a new generation picked up the work. Larry Dean Olson's Outdoor Survival Skills, published in 1967, connected indigenous techniques to modern practice and became a foundational text for the survival skills movement. Morris Kochanski's Bushcraft, published in 1987, documented northern woodcraft with meticulous attention to the details that made techniques work. Ron Hood, operating through his company Hood's Woods from the 1990s through the 2000s, produced what may be the most systematic modern documentation of the firebed itself, teaching it to thousands of students and recording his methods across dozens of instructional videos. The technique never appears in the U.S. Army Survival Manual. It's not taught in most outdoor education programs. It exists now in a strange limbo, well known within a small community of bushcraft enthusiasts and survival instructors, essentially unknown to the general public. A method that once meant the difference between life and death for thousands of people has become a historical curiosity, demonstrated at primitive skills gatherings and discussed on internet forums, but almost never used in genuine necessity. What remains, then, is not the firebed as a living practice, but as a window into a world that no longer exists. There is something profound in contemplating what ordinary people once knew. Not scholars, not specialists, but working men and women whose survival depended on practical knowledge that most of us have never considered. The trapper who could look at a stretch of terrain and know, without consciously calculating where to dig, how to build, when to sleep. The scout who carried in their head a library of techniques for managing heat and cold, shelter and exposure that would fill volumes if written down. The homesteader who understood, in their hands and their habits, 100 small adjustments that made life possible in conditions we can barely imagine enduring. We've gained enormously from the technologies that replace these skills. No one would seriously argue that we should return to a world where a night's sleep required hours of preparation and a miscalculation could be fatal. The firebed faded because better options became available, cheaper, easier, safer options that freed people from the labor of survival and allowed them to direct their energy toward other things. But something was lost too. Not just the technique itself, but the relationship to the physical world that the technique represented. The firebed required understanding soil, understanding fire, understanding heat and time, and the properties of materials. It required attention to conditions, adaptation to circumstances, the application of principles rather than the following of instructions. It required, in short, a kind of practical intelligence that we rarely cultivate anymore. A fluency with the material world that has been made unnecessary by the very technologies that have improved our lives. The frontiersmen who used the firebed were not superhuman. They were ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances, developing knowledge over generations through trial and observation and the slow accumulation of what worked. What they knew, we could learn, if we had the need and the time and the willingness to pay attention to what the world itself teaches. We probably won't. Most of us will never build a firebed, never need to, never face circumstances where the knowledge would matter. But there is value in knowing that such knowledge existed, in understanding that our ancestors possessed capabilities we have lost, that the practical wisdom of the past was not primitive or simple, but sophisticated and hard-won, that the line between survival and death was once held by techniques passed hand to hand across generations until the world changed and the need passed away. The firebed is a small thing. A trench in the earth, a fire burned down to coals, a covering of dirt, a night's warmth in the cold. But it contains within it a larger story of human adaptation and ingenuity, of knowledge that lived in practice rather than text, of a world where ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things because they had no other choice. Somewhere in Montana in 1887, 3 cowboys sat on horseback in a blizzard. The photograph doesn't show where they slept that night, but they survived. They knew something, those men. Something that kept them alive when the cold pressed down and the fire in the stove was 100 miles away. Something most of us have never heard of, passed down through demonstrations and corrections, and nights spent learning what worked. Not enough dirt, just enough dirt. The warm earth beneath you, the frozen world above, and sleep.